You talk about sort of these global impacts. For example, Russia selling oil and gas outside. Well, India bought cheap power energy of Russia, and the West said, "Why are you doing that?" And India said, "Well, why wouldn't we? Why wouldn't we?" There was this Nelson Mandela was asked by the Americans, "Why are you treating Cuba as a friend? You know that we have a problem with Cuba. Why are you treating Cuba as a friend?" And Nelson Mandela, when you've been in jail for 27 years, you talk very slowly. I mean, nobody rushes. So he has this very deep, very slow, every word is important to him. And he said, "My friend, the fundamental mistake of American geopolitics is you think your enemy should be my enemy. Cuba's not my enemy. Cuba supported the ANC during apartheid. Why would I not do that? China, as an example, only has national self-interest. So does India only have national self-interest. Why would they not buy cheap oil or cheap energy from Russia if they have the opportunity? Why would they not do that? And so, and what I want to come to you is, and you spoke about, Jaroslav, the failure or the collapse of post-World War II, post-Cold War institutions, which we are seeing absolutely. What we're not seeing is a global response to global issues. We are seeing actually the opposite. We're seeing fracturing. We are seeing tariffs coming in play. We are seeing literal fences going up, both literal and metaphorical fences going up, and trying to divide ourselves from the world, separate ourselves, isolate ourselves from the world. Andrew, is there any hope of humanity, this wonderful thing called humanity, on this wonderful planet that we've been given, actually finding global responses towards our absolutely planetary level issues? Or are we down the path of just continued human stupidity, greediness, and short-sightedness?
I think if you want to study resilience, study human stupidity, because it's remarkably resilient. But I will make a couple of comments. Mm. So as a historian and political scientist, when we saw the collapse of the former Soviet Union, nobody really expected that something else not to come back. People who were in those disciplines said, we have seen this before. So whether it's the Portuguese, the Spanish, the Dutch, the British, the French with their various forms of empires, you can go back to Middle Eastern empires before Christ. There are patterns here that we've seen before. So to suddenly think that humans are going to function totally differently, what we've done is we've fooled ourselves into what we've seen for the last 30 years or sort of post-Second World War is the way that humanity in the world operates. And if you look at history, it doesn't operate that way. So I think one of the challenges here for organisations is to get to grips with the fact that what we've experienced for the last, I'll go 1945 to 1990 and then 1990 to about 2020, these are unusual in his history sense. And like many political scientists, it confuses me with economists that so much of what they put forward in their models often don't work. And I think there's one of the issues here is there is an expectation that with a population of 8 billion people in the world, we talk about, but this is the Western view. I think the West makes up somewhere between 1 billion and 1.5 billion. That's not even 80%. Like, we've been in the power seat for a long time, but we actually need to recognise the rest of the world has a very different view of the way things should be run. And I think India's comments about, and I'm paraphrasing, so please forgive me, this is not our battle. This is a cheap source of energy for us. You look at that and you say, I can see how you would have that perspective. I think the other thing, like I like David's BANI acronym and model. What concerns me about it, though, greatly is whilst David is considered and well thought out in the way he's explained that, we will have some very flashy consultant that's well known internationally that'll turn that into a white paper and it'll just be, we've just got to do this and it's really simple and we've got a model and we'll fix everything for you. So I think that for me is the problem with VUCA, or if you come out of the Oxford scenario area, tuna, or whatever the word or model that you want to use, those people are actually trained in it to think deeply about it. It's a very valuable tool, but it's all these things have been sold off and they're being used by consultants. some good, some bad. And it's just become buzzwords. So everybody now looks at these things, oh, that's a buzzword. Well, a hammer's not very useful for putting a screw in, but it's really good for a nail. But you have to understand that. I like you, when we talk about unprecedented, I'd appreciate it really if people stop using that word unless it was unprecedented. There is a vast difference between being in uncharted waters and being in waters without a chart. So again, as a historian, I see many, many things that come up and, this is unprecedented. You don't actually need to go back that far. In some cases, only 10 or 20 years to see something very similar to this happening. So for me, the piece here is about how do we get people who think deeply to come together and really explore these things and recognize that. And even the project models that we use, you see one box after. You don't just stick those boxes in a line. Stuff has to happen between them. So when we do something, what are we actually expecting to happen from that? And if it doesn't happen, how do we make changes? So I'll come back to some of the comments that David was making in very broad terms. Like I've now done in 5 years, I've done 5 courses with GCSP and I'm enrolled in a 6th. So I obviously see value in what they present. And one of the things that I get out of those is they bring such a diverse group of people to discuss issues. And those discussions are more like a dance than an argument. There's recognition that you need to give and take. They're not combative. They're not about people trying to point score. GCSP, and quite possibly because it's based in Switzerland, we know the Swiss are very neutral, do an excellent job in bringing people together to have those discussions. So as I said, I've done 5 courses with them. I've been to a number of their online processes. My biggest complaint about GCSP is they need to run more courses in Singapore or somewhere close to Australia. It's a long way to go to Geneva, David. The very expensive prices. But the next thing is, why aren't there more places like that? Why don't we have more think tanks that can have those discussions rather than take a very siloed, very partisan approach? So do I think there's hope? I always think there's hope. I think the broader question is, how do we get institutions that people can have a degree of trust, but actually recognise that that's a safe place for people to have these discussions and not to be castigated for having a view that's different to, in what in many cases is the dominant Western narrative, and we know that narrative changes over time. My final comment would be around, we look at some of these big businesses and we talk about companies like Google and Amazon as being some of the most powerful companies that we've ever seen. I would remind people that both the British East Indies Company and the Dutch East Indies Company had their own armies, their own ships, their own judges. They could impose the death penalty on somebody in their colonies. Google, Amazon, they're not running their own fleet of ships. They're not running their own armies. They're not running their own judicial system. They may have significant influence on all of those things, but they're nowhere near as powerful as organisations that we've seen in the past. So I think we really need to sort of have a bit of a look at the way we see these things and recognise where we are on a continuum of activity, rather than assuming the experience that we're having now has never been had before in any way, shape or form. And that's a little bit more about thinking about principles and less about what I'm physically seeing today. And I think that more conceptual and abstract thought is frequently where we struggle.
Of course, the East India and the Dutch East India companies were based about resource deployment or resource depletion and management. The resource we have nowadays is data. Data is the new resource. So, to say that, they had their own armies and ships, you don't need armies and ships now. What you need is servers, and you need control of data and information. Maybe that is just the new paradigm.